Good.
Just let me check. So just a moment. I'm just getting the clearance from our social media team so that then we can. Yes. So namaste, Ms. Priyanka. Thank you so much for accepting our invite despite your ongoing hectic schedule in between the parliament sessions that's happening and agreeing to share your thoughts with youth of India today. I mean, we really are grateful to you for and to all of them who would also be joining us today. Thank you so much once again.
Namaste, Sailesh, and thank you for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure to be on your show.
Right. You know, most of you do already know about Ms. Priyanka, but still I would like to add a few more things that she has been passionately doing and she has been responsibly continuing back in New Zealand. Ms. Priyanka has lived and worked overseas and worked around Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa, right? So she has spent her work life advocating on behalf of groups of people whose voices are often unheard, particularly women survivors of domestic violence and migrant workers who have been exploited and lobbying government for legislative and policy change. She has also worked with our diverse communities across Aotearoa and is committed to ensuring that the voices are heard at all levels of decision making. For Priyanka, politics is about choices. She believes that decision making should be community led and should lead to better outcomes for everyone, not just the privileged few. She believes that everyone should have the opportunity to live with dignity. That means equitable access to affordable housing, quality education, and decent, secure work. It also means that everyone should feel safe both in their homes and on the streets. Currently, Ms. Priyanka is the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Minister for Ethnic Communities and a least member of Parliament based in Maungakiekie, Auckland. She's also a member of the Foreign Affairs, Defense and Trade Select Committee and Deputy Chair of the Social Services and Community Select Committee in the New Zealand Parliament. We once again thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sailesh.
Ma'am, we want to initiate, listen more from you of your life experiences, your journey as being a parliament, and if you could also talk about in brief about the lockdown that has happened in New Zealand. So we would be very grateful to hear it from you, Ms. Priyanka.
Sure. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to be on this evening. Namaste, and as we say in New Zealand, so Aotearoa is the Māori name for New Zealand, and here we say in greeting kia ora, so kia ora to you all as well. So you wanted to know a little bit about my journey into politics.
Right.
So I was born in India. I grew up in Singapore, which is where my parents were working at the time, and so went to school there and so on and so forth. And then came to a point in my life where I wanted to sort of step out of my comfort zone. I think anyone who's been to Singapore will know that generally life is quite comfortable there. And I wanted to go somewhere where I didn't know anyone and sort of forge my own path and do my own thing. And also, my parents left and went back to India at the time. This was about 2000. So I chose New Zealand because, firstly, I have worked all my life in the women's rights space. And for me, the fact that New Zealand was the first developed country in the world where women won the right to vote was a huge draw card for me. Of course, it's also, incredibly scenic. It's a beautiful country. It's known to have very good work-life balance. And I didn't know anyone here. So it was ideal. It ticked all the boxes for me. So I moved here to finish my university. I came here as an international student. Didn't really intend to stay on in New Zealand, but within about a year or so, I fell in love with the country and decided to stay. I've worked, as you've mentioned in the introduction, largely in the domestic violence prevention space, both with an NGO called Shakti that works with Asian, African, Middle Eastern women here in New Zealand. So I did sort of the direct casework, working with women often to get out of incredibly abusive, dangerous situations. Led a team to set up the first ethnic women's refuge in the Bay of Plenty, which is sort of in the North Island of New Zealand, a few hours further south from where I am now, which is Auckland. I was also the organization's media spokesperson for a while and lobbied government at that time for policy change based on the experiences of the women who had come for support. Through that, I was also a member of the Labour Party, the New Zealand Labour Party. So I joined about 2 years after I moved to New Zealand because my boss at the time was standing or running for Parliament, and that's how I actually got involved. But then I realized that the values that the party is founded on, so values of fairness, solidarity, social justice, and equality of opportunity. So regardless of who you are, where you come from, you should be able to access good quality education, housing, the justice system, and decent, secure work. So those values reflected my own. And so I stayed with the party, worked behind the scenes.
Mhm.
I was always, I guess, the family that I was brought up in was political in the sense that we were, we were encouraged to sort of think through issues and challenge the status quo, but we were never party political. So this was my first foray into party politics. I never intended to stand for parliament myself. Most migrants don't. We usually move to a country when we're trying to survive and
Mhm.
get ahead and so on and so forth. But in 2014, to cut a long story short, I came into contact with a former senior cabinet minister who suggested that I might want to run for parliament because most of my work at that time, both in the NGO sector and in the public service, had been advocating for change. And so he said to me, "You've been for so many years knocking on the doors for change. Why don't you try and sit at the table and be part of that change?" And that appealed to me. And so I thought I'd give it a shot. Ran for Parliament in 2014, didn't quite make it, missed out by a small margin. And so I stood again and entered Parliament in 2017. So I'm a first-term member of Parliament.
Wow, that is quite inspiring. Especially, as you mentioned, in the foreign land, it is more about survival, and you've made it to the top. This is quite really inspiring for a lot of us who just go back to foreign land for studies, and then you see that you have actually made such an impactful decision, being in the parliament and again serving with as much as you can by being on the table as well.
Thank you. Actually, we have quite a large ethnic community here in New Zealand.
Right.
Close to 15% of the population, over 200 different ethnicities. The Indian community here is very large, or the wider South Asian community, and they contribute greatly across a number of fields. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that the only way that you can serve is through politics. There are many other ways, and there are many from our communities who are doing that day in, day out.
Right.
This is just one way, and a way
Right.
to make change at a mass scale.
Mm-hmm. So, Ms. Priyanka, yeah.
I was just going to say that you'd also asked me to touch on the COVID situation that
That's right.
we've been. Would you like?
Please.
Yeah. So I just, I guess also, I mean, India's going through your own journey, I guess, through this horrific pandemic. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's difficult times for many in both our countries. And it has been here as well. We've, I guess, come out of it now. We are, I think, on latest count, I think this is our 19th day in New Zealand with no new cases, and we have no active cases as well. So we've done well in that regard. But the last few months, for those who have lost their jobs, people who have lost family members and friends, and many of our migrant workers who face uncertainty in their future, it's been really difficult. For us, though, we've had, I guess, a little bit an advantage of time. We could see how the pandemic was unfolding overseas, largely in Europe and in China. So we could see what was coming. It was just a matter of time before we had the first case here in New Zealand. And so our government's taken some unprecedented steps, like closing the border. And this was on the 20th of March, if I'm not mistaken. We closed our borders, and that was the first time that we've done that in the history of New Zealand. So it was a strong step. It was closed to everyone who's not a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. And there was put in place something called a travel ban exception, which allows people with a critical need who are not citizens or permanent residents, but have a critical need to travel to New Zealand, there was a small exception for some of them on humanitarian grounds to reunite families and that sort of thing. But it's been quite strict because the border represents the biggest threat to us in terms of the spread of COVID. So, I mean, prior to border restrictions, I think we had about 20,000 people who were coming into New Zealand every day from overseas. The other thing, of course, is that we went into, so the government put in place what was known as an alert level system, alert level 1 to 4, 4 being the strictest, and a complete lockdown. And so we went into lockdown, I think, a few days after the border closed. It was something like the 23rd of March, very quickly. We went into lockdown, which meant that everyone had to stay at home. So if you were an essential worker, if you worked in the health sector, or essential services, which was, the necessities of life, supermarkets, things like that, health services, clinics, pharmacies, those stayed open. And people who worked there were strict precautions on the numbers that could go in, the distance that needed to be kept, and all of that. All the rest of us stayed at home. So it was a complete lockdown. Restaurants, everything was shut. Theaters, so on and so forth. No recreational activities that were allowed. Travel was severely limited. You could only travel if you were an essential worker. All gatherings in public venues closed. All businesses closed except for the essential services. And we stayed in alert level 4 for just over a month, so about 33 days in total. And that allowed us to ensure that the health response was strong. So, people who had symptoms could be tested, contact traced, and we could sort of quarantine those who were ill. So we've had very few who have needed hospital treatment. We've had 22 deaths so far. But as I mentioned, now we're 19 days free of COVID. We've also had a strong economic response to ensure that businesses were given, there's something called a wage subsidy scheme that was the main part of our economic response. A sum of money that was paid to businesses that qualified so that they could pay wages or salaries for their workers. So the whole point was an investment by the government to ensure that businesses could maintain that contact with their workers so that when things opened up, they hadn't lost their workers and workers had money to be able to feed their families throughout this period. So I might just leave it there because there's a huge amount more that I could go into as well.
Right. But then I think the best of what you mentioned is the success story of the past 19 days that, New Zealand has really taken up, and over the last 19 days that we haven't have any patient so far. So I think this is something of a success and a positive news that it could come out for a lot of our viewers as well today, that, it could be fought and it is possible, not that we have to be scared and fearful about. So, Ms. Priyanka, there are a lot of questions that have started to come up also on the live sessions that is happening through Facebook. And, I would also request all of viewers, if you would have any further questions for Ms. Priyanka, you could also post it on the social media on our Facebook page. And we see that our team members are suggesting that more than 110 members, people have shared the live video that's already on the page. So, I think this session is going in quite insightful and more, exciting for a lot of our viewers as well. So, if you don't mind, I would, straight away head towards asking you something which you also mentioned earlier. How difficult was it for you to make your space in a foreign land, especially in the field of politics, and then sitting on the table in the parliament? So how did you take up that journey, and how difficult was it for you as well?
Well, they do say that anything worth doing is not easy. And so, I guess that holds true to a certain extent. But if I'm completely honest, for me, I think it's partly testament to the kind of place that New Zealand is. That it is generally, it's not that we're perfect, we have issues, but generally it's quite an open, inclusive society. Access to politicians is reasonably easy in New Zealand. I mean, people have, gone to their local supermarket and bumped into the Prime Minister, so who's doing her weekly grocery shopping. So that's partly the way that New Zealand is. It's quite an easy society, or friendly. I've generally found it as a new migrant, a warm and welcoming society. So in that sense, it's potentially a little bit easier to get into the field of politics because,
Right.
you can sit down with politicians and talk to them about what it's like and how to get in. And it's easy to join a party, to get involved. And that, I guess, is what I did. But as I said to you at the start, that was never a game plan of mine. It was, partly things fell into place because maybe they were meant to be to a certain extent. But when I look back now, the steps that I took was largely to be really invested in the work that I was doing. I was incredibly passionate about the work that I did and the change that I wanted to see for the women and children that we supported at Shakwi. Also certain issues that disproportionately affected those women, sort of, pushing for change and awareness of those issues as well. I also worked for a while with a former member of parliament. He's actually currently the mayor of Auckland, which is our largest city here and the one I live in. But he was our former leader of the party. He was a former foreign affairs minister and held quite a few different portfolios. At the time when I worked with him, he was our spokesperson for ethnic communities. So I worked with him to engage our diverse communities, find out what some of the barriers are to our people getting ahead and what Labour could do and now the government can do to address some of that and support the aspirations. So I think for me, what it boils down to is doing whatever it is that you do well, because there's no one sort of pathway to get to politics. Politics, at the end of the day, here, the House of Representatives is meant to be representative of the population of New Zealand. That means ensuring that different voices are represented there, and yeah, so the all of us come from different paths. We've all done different things. We've got lawyers, business people, NGO workers like myself, doctors, and so we bring different skill sets, and that's what I think makes a representative group work well. So I guess my very long-winded way of saying, do what you do really well. It isn't easy. You've got to work hard. That holds true for anything that you do in life. And New Zealand, I guess, makes it a little bit easier.
Right. You have actually mentioned what I think a lot of young people have started to believe in now. If we have sincerity of heart, a clarity of mind, and a zeal and a passion to serve, I think everything falls in its place by itself.
Yeah, and your values. I think you need
Right.
to really drill down to why you want to do this in the first place.
True.
What are your values? For
Mm-hmm.
me, it's always been social justice that has driven
Right.
me. We see inequality in any society, even one that is known to be quite egalitarian, like New Zealand. You
Right.
see inequality, and
Correct.
what drives me is that, and
Mm-hmm.
the fact that this is one way to change the laws to
Mm-hmm.
try and make the world or your society a fairer place for everyone.
Correct. That's absolutely true. And I think this is something that a lot of us, at this current time, do need as well. Ms. Priyanka, there are a lot of young viewers who are joining us today. According to you, what do you think? You also mentioned earlier that, social service and politics is just one way of doing it. But according to you, what is the slight difference between social service and politics? Because a lot of us tend to get confused with social service and politics, as both of them is service to humanity. And I understand that there's a rising misunderstanding that social activists mostly land up to become politicians. So how do you see that?
I guess I'll go back also to the point that I made earlier, which is that regardless of what your path, your occupation, or your passion in life is, I suspect there's a place for you I believe that there's a place for you in politics,
Right.
because at the end of the day, that's about making the world a better place.
Mm-hmm.
That of course is a very idealistic way of looking at it. The difference between social services or being in the NGO field, because that's the field that I know best. Um, Politics at the end of the day is the way in which you affect change is different. So in a social
Right.
service setting, it's much more, firstly, it's much more direct. So, you know, for example, if I'm working with a family that has a particular need and I'm trying to address that need with them or advocate for them, it's very immediate. The world of politics can take a much longer time. So change can be a lot slower, and that sometimes frustrates people. You also, you know, it's also quite a competitive field, and so you have to be aware of that, and you have to be a little bit tough because you're always in the public eye, for example, and with that comes some responsibility in terms of what you say and so on and so forth. So I think the responsibilities are quite different. I mean, it's two completely different fields. At the end of the day, the outcome that you're looking for may be the same in terms of the change that you want to push for, but the way in which you need to work to be able to get that can be quite different. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. I think it is absolutely right to take and understand how you mentioned about with greater power comes greater responsibility, and that is absolutely right. You know,
That's a good way of putting it.
right. So, you know, there are few people who are joining in from Auckland as well. Maharajan, who appreciates you for speaking up for ethnic communities. And there's something that is coming up next, which is, you know, how do you see that the youth of Norway, you know, and youth of India could, in future, work with your leadership and mentorship? And do you find any possibilities of collateral partnerships that can happen between youth of Norway and youth of India in general?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the pandemic has shown us really is the importance, or I guess just the way we're so interconnected. You know, it's something that on some level people have kind of bought into, but the pandemic has shown us really clearly how interconnected we are, regardless of which part of the world we live in. And so I think collaboration is absolutely the way to go. From now on. Also, you know, the potential to exchange ideas across different countries, to learn from one another, to collaborate on projects. I think the possibilities are immense. I mean, between I'm not as familiar with Norway specifically, but between New Zealand and India, for example, there are quite a few different initiatives, also quite youth focused. So your members or your viewers might be interested in that. One of the organizations that I'm also involved with is the Asia New Zealand Foundation. I'm part of their leadership network. And one of the things they do is to, you know, the main point of this organization is to sort of increase awareness within New Zealand of countries in Asia, and sort of promote those exchanges between countries. And so there are internship projects that they support between New Zealand and India specifically. There's also quite recently, so actually, interesting fact, the last international travel that I did before our lockdown was to India.
Wow.
I was there with our Deputy Prime Minister and our Trade Minister. We took along a delegation of people from New Zealand from across different sectors. And the reason we were there was to strengthen that connection between, you know, the foreign affairs and trade connections between India and New Zealand. But one of the things that happened while we were there was the launch of an initiative by the Tata Consultancy Services. They've got a branch here in New Zealand, and they've started what's called the India-New Zealand Youth Dialogue. So it's a platform for, I think what they're looking at is about 20 young people from each country to come together. I think it's once in 3 years to exchange ideas and collaborate on various things, issues that matter. It was meant to start next year. Now, I don't know if COVID has pushed the timelines back a little bit, but the Deputy Prime Minister launched that initiative with them when we were there in India. So like that, there are so many different initiatives, different partnerships that can happen with young people from across the globe. And I think that could only, you know, lead us from strength to strength.
That's true. Absolutely. I think it is also very important, as you mentioned, that it's, you know, to engage more young people into policy making and into the tables of change. As a young person yourself, you know, we have seen that you have initiated this youth MP initiative wherein you let young people to, you know, represent your constituency in the parliament and to also participate in the same way that you do. So it's something that, you know, it inspires, and I think it is more largely in the New Zealand all across.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I can't actually take credit for that because that's actually an initiative by the New Zealand Parliament
Right.
that all of us are part of. And
Mhm.
also, I'm not 100% sure that I qualify as young, but anyway, in the field of politics, perhaps. But yeah, the Youth MP initiative is fabulous. So we do it once in 3 years in Parliament. Every sitting member of Parliament can have a youth MP, and generally does. And we decide how we select that person. And so I ran a selection process that was
Mhm.
that mirrored my selection
Mhm.
process, and had
Right.
about 5 or 6 young people
Mhm.
be part of that process.
Mhm.
And the person who, and I had a separate panel that actually picked the one person who got through,
Right. Mhm.
and she's just a phenomenal young
Mhm.
person. So you're right. So initiatives like that give
Mhm.
young people the opportunity to have a taste of what politics is like, what
Right.
parliament is like.
Correct. There's as you speak, your passion to continuously serve. I think it is also very could be very useful to understand what has been your source of inspiration and motivation to regularly serve and amplify the voices of the people in the parliament as well.
What has been my
Uh,
inspiration?
yes, and a source of motivation. Yeah.
Yeah, so I sort of touched on values when I answered a question a little bit earlier on, and I think that, and so I would look to my parents because they are the people who molded or shaped the way that I thought and instilled in me some of those values that remain my guiding lights today.
Mhm.
In difficult times, often that's what you hold on to, and that's what makes you true to yourself. So definitely my parents, who are incredible people, and my first inspiration. I would also say the picture that you have behind you, Swami Vivekananda, I'm very familiar
Right.
with his teachings, and was exposed to his teachings and that of his guru,
Mhm.
Sri Ramakrishna, as a very young child, from when I was 3 years old, actually. And so some of their teachings around what we're doing this for
Mhm.
have also shaped those values and
Right.
need to stick strongly to honesty, to
Mhm.
to be truthful, and those are things that sometimes when times are tough can go out the window,
Right.
but those sort of teachings and
Mhm.
values continue to
Mhm.
I guess shape what I do, and
Mhm.
also that I guess the values around equality. That
Right.
at the end of the day, you started with namaste. And
Mhm.
we know that namaste means essentially that the divinity within me bows to the divinity within you. That for me is the essence of equality, that regardless of gender,
Mhm.
ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status,
Mhm.
that our value is intrinsically the same. And
Right.
so that's also what guides me. So in the work that I do as the private secretary to the minister for
Mhm.
ethnic communities, it means that I work very closely with the minister,
Mhm.
and I think we have about 200, a ethnic community or diverse community made up of about 200 people from about 216 different ethnicities, speaking collectively about 160 languages. And
Mhm.
so while I maintain that our value is the same, that diversity that we bring is beautiful. And for me, I believe that New Zealand is strong as a country because of the diversity that we
Mhm.
have and not in spite of it. So I'm not sort of sidelining that. I think that is beautiful. The diversity of thought,
Mhm.
experience, and background that we collectively bring should be encouraged.
Mhm.
But essentially, in terms of human beings, our value remains the same. And for me, that's what motivates me, to
Right.
ensure that we have the same access to opportunities.
Correct. So, do you think that your Indian origin has really helped you in strengthening those values and the culture that you talk about today?
I would assume so, but I can't that's all I know. So I can't really compare it to
Right.
anything else.
Right.
But those are the values that were instilled
Mhm.
in me by my parents,
Correct.
and our philosophy at a young age. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
that somebody else with a different upbringing can't have the same
Mhm.
values, though.
True.
But for me, that's how I came about them.
Correct. Ms. Priyanka, there's something that is coming up on the live by a youth person called Hitesh. How does the labor union work there so that India could to adopt some measures out of it from New Zealand? Is there any? Would you want to talk about how the labor
Yeah,
union
sure.
works there in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. So we have a few different unions. I'm a union member myself,
Right.
and I'm very strongly supportive of the union movement because that is the movement that sort of bridges sometimes the gap that exists between workers and their bosses, their employers, and makes strives to make conditions fairer for workers. So I'm a supporter. We've got a reasonably strong movement, union movement here that and different unions that represent different sectors, for example. So we've got the Public Service Association, which represents the public service. Of course, the government is the largest employer here, and so there are a number of people who are represented. I used to be part of that. I used to work for the Ministry for Women as a policy analyst as well. That was part of my work experience before Parliament, and at that point, I was a member of the PSA and a delegate at the workplace for a
Right.
short while. Yeah, so basically, so one of the things that that the union movement is pushing for example, is fair pay agreements. How do we make conditions and
Right.
wages fairer across different sectors? And especially so currently we have an issue where in sectors that are female dominated, for example, the pay tends to be less. And work can be precarious in
Right.
certain sectors, so not secure work that pays well. And that's what they're pushing for, and that our government supports that and works. We're the Labour Party. We're born from the Labour movement and want to make things fairer for workers as well. So I don't know if that gives the person who asked the question any ideas as to how to, but it's basically about organizing. So it's about collectively coming together to ensure that your voice, because your voice is always louder as a collective rather than
Right.
just one individual.
Mhm.
Work out what kinds of conditions that you want to push for through legislation, and then lobby the government. That's basically how it works here. And if
Right.
you're a worker, join a union.
Right.
We actually saw that during the COVID pandemic as well,
Mhm.
quite a bit, where some employers, people had directly approached me as well, saying that their employer has got the wage subsidy, which was the payment that I mentioned to you earlier. It is paid to the employer, but it's meant to be passed on completely to the employee. And some employees weren't seeing that happening. And so that's when unions stepped in and had a conversation with the employers to say that, look, so and so is missing out on the wage subsidy. Can you? And so they broker a deal between the two. So it doesn't need to be aggressive. It doesn't need to be nasty, but it's just a little bit of a check and balance to make sure
Right.
everyone's acting fairly.
Correct. Since a childhood, we have been taught there's unity in diversity, I think in India, but then as you speak, we also understand this is largely for across the globe and especially in New Zealand, as you talk about. Ms. Priyanka, we do understand that you have a lot of engagements that is coming up and you have your next session in the next 1 hour as well. So I think we would just end up with your last message. So what would be your last message for youth of India and for all the viewers who are watching us today, so that we could go back in our daily lives into the new normal that is going to happen from
Mm,
2020? Yeah.
yeah. I guess it would just be to do what you do really well, to put your heart and soul into it, whatever that might be, and do it to the best of your ability. The other message may be less relevant to other youth. It's probably relevant to me when I was younger, and that was to not underestimate yourself. Don't underestimate what you can do, and especially what you can do as a collective when you come together to strengthen that voice. And finally, just to do what you need to do to get through this pandemic, because I know that yeah, especially in some parts of India, cases are rising, and so it's a time of turbulence or uncertainty for many. So just be kind to yourself and do what you need to do to get through this and get to that new normal.
Right. So I think this sums up everything that you've mentioned. Together, we can do a lot more, and it is really challenging to do anything individually. And I think the message that you are, leaving us with about the values that you have mentioned, standing strong with your values, especially with the namaste that you mentioned, the divinity within us, to, respect the divinity with another person, irrespective of any community, caste, religion, and creed that he or she comes from. And also, the larger message that you gave, that the bilateral partnerships in future, that youth of Norway and youth of India could work. And as a youth-led organization ourselves, present in about 15 states across the country, we look forward to your mentorship and guidance, and absolutely looking forward to host you in India whenever you have your next trip. We hope that we get to meet sometime soon, and get a chance for the young people to take from your guidance in future, and learn from your leadership. So thank you so much, Ms. Priyanka, once again for accepting our invite and being with us here today. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you once again for the opportunity, and I look forward to meeting you in person at some point in the future.
Right. Thank you so much, and namaste.
Namaste.